An elderly woman, Isabella Rossi, forgotten and neglected by her own family, walked alone through the streets, carrying the weight of a life filled with loneliness. As she passed by a trash can, a faint sound made her stop. Her heart raced when she saw a baby abandoned among the garbage bags. Trembling, she approached, and as she picked the child up in her arms, she found a letter attached to the small body. The words written left her terrified. "I can't go on." Discovering that I am, the unfinished sentence held a dark secret, and she knew her life would never be the same. It was a morning like any other for Isabella Rossi. The sun had barely risen on the horizon, casting a pale glow over the empty streets of the neighborhood. She clutched her coat against her body while pushing her old wheelbarrow filled with discarded items she collected to turn into something useful. At 64, life had never been easy for her, and loneliness was her only constant companion. Without children or a husband, Isabella Rossi survived on the little she earned selling her crafts at fairs. As she walked, something unusual caught her attention, a faint sound, almost imperceptible, coming from a nearby trash can. Initially, she thought it was a cat or a dog trapped inside, but the sound was different, more human. Curious and a bit frightened, she approached. The trash can was filled with crumpled papers and leftover food, but deep inside, something was moving. With trembling hands, Isabella Rossi began to remove the garbage that covered the sound. When she finally had a clear view, her heart stopped for a second. Wrapped in a dirty blanket was a little girl with wide eyes and an innocent smile on her face. "My God," murmured Isabella Rossi, bringing her hands to her mouth in disbelief. She looked around, fearing she would be seen. The street was deserted, and the silence was almost oppressive. Her first instinct was to run away, to leave it all behind as if she had never seen the child. After all, what could she, an old and poor woman, do for an abandoned baby? But something stopped her from moving. The girl's gaze, her fragility, and that small hand reaching out to her held her in place. "Who left you here?" whispered Isabella Rossi, feeling the weight of responsibility fall on her shoulders. Gently, she cradled the baby, trying to soothe her. It was a little girl, no more than a few months old. There was an envelope attached to the blanket along with a small bag containing some belongings. When she opened the envelope, Isabella Rossi found a letter written in careful but hurried handwriting. "Please take care of her. I can't go on. I am sick and cannot protect her. Her name is Livia. All I ask is that she grows up in a home full of love. God bless her." Isabella Rossi read the letter several times, trying to absorb what had just happened. Her body trembled, not just from the morning chill but from the magnitude of the decision she would have to make. She looked again at the girl in her arms, Livia, that was her name now. The baby's gentle smile shattered something inside her. The loneliness she had carried for so many years began to dissolve, replaced by a new emotion, the responsibility of being needed by someone. She knew it wouldn't be easy. The neighborhood where she lived was cruel, filled with gossip and judgment, especially for someone like her, an elderly woman who had already been betrayed and abandoned by her husband. But for some reason, the thought of leaving Livia behind seemed even more impossible. "Come on, little one," said Isabella Rossi with newfound determination in her voice, "let's go home." She covered the girl with the blanket once more, placed her in her wheelbarrow, and began to push it back to her humble home. As she passed through the door, Isabella Rossi felt the weight of her new reality. She had no idea how she would take care of the girl, where she would find the resources, but she knew that somehow she would find a way. She settled Livia in an old wicker basket improvised as a cradle and watched the little girl fall asleep quickly, as if she knew she was now safe. Sitting at the kitchen table, Isabella Rossi wondered what the future held for them. The only thing she knew for sure was that from that moment on, her life would never be the same. With Livia asleep and her heart full of doubts, Isabella Rossi offered a brief prayer, thanking for the unexpected gift she had found that cold morning. She knew that the challenges were just beginning, but Livia's smile, even in those few hours, had already sparked a flame of hope in her heart. That same night, while Livia slept peacefully in her makeshift cradle, Isabella Rossi couldn't close her eyes. She looked at the little girl, feeling a mix of fear and hope stirring inside her. Memories of her own life began to invade her mind, bringing to the surface old wounds that had never fully healed. Isabella Rossi had once been married to Marco. In the early years, they were happy. He was a hard-working man with a good heart, and together they dreamed of starting a family. But fate had been cruel. When she finally became pregnant after many years of trying, their joy was shattered by tragedy. She lost the baby in a fall on a rainy day, and the pain of that moment never left her. "I also dreamed of being a mother," Isabella Rossi whispered to herself, feeling a tear roll down her cheek. The loss of the child changed everything. Marco, once loving and supportive, began to drift away. Grief consumed them both but in different ways. While Isabella Rossi sank into loneliness and guilt, Marco sought refuge in other people and eventually in another woman. He betrayed her and left, leaving her alone with the weight of a life that would never be what she had imagined. "You left me when I needed you the most," she murmured, staring into the void. Now, looking at Livia, Isabella Rossi felt that something inside her was healing, even if slowly and painfully. The child had arrived unexpectedly, and the responsibility of caring for her made Isabella Rossi feel useful again, something she hadn't felt in years. But the fear of failing consumed her as well. "I can't take care of you. I'm just an old woman with nothing," she said softly, as if speaking to the girl. But Livia slept, innocent and unaware of the whirlwind of emotions passing through Isabella Rossi's mind. The elderly woman's heart, however, was divided. She knew that raising a child would be difficult, especially under her current circumstances. She could barely sustain herself with what she earned from recycling and crafts, and the city, with its relentless residents, was no place for someone like Livia. However, every time she looked at the little girl, the memory of her painful past, she remembered how she had dreamed of holding her own child in her arms, singing to him, and watching him grow. What had been taken from her so cruelly now seemed to have returned unexpectedly. Marco, the name still echoed in her mind like a distant memory. Since he left her, Isabella Rossi had never heard from him again, nor had she sought him out. The resentment she carried was too heavy, and reliving that past seemed futile. But now, with Livia in her life, she felt the need to make peace with what had happened. "Maybe this is my chance to do things differently," she reflected, almost as if talking to the baby. Despite all the difficulties, something about Livia's presence made her feel that this was her second chance. Even though she no longer had the strength and youth of her earlier days, she now possessed the wisdom of her years and the resilience of someone who had survived pain. She decided that no matter how difficult it was, she would give everything she could so that Livia would have what she could never provide for the child she lost. Isabella Rossi rose from her chair and walked to the window of her small home. The night was silent, and the cold of the early morning seeped into the room. Outside, the stars shone faintly, but the moon was full, illuminating the sleeping neighborhood. "Tomorrow will be another day," she said with a heavy sigh. She knew she couldn't count on anyone to help her. However, she also knew that she would not leave the little girl behind, just as life had left her so many times. With one last look at Livia, Isabella Rossi went to bed, still with her heart heavy. As she closed her eyes, the memories of the past began to slowly fade away, giving way to the image of an uncertain future yet full of possibilities. The next morning brought a new light for Isabella Rossi, but with it came the weight of the decisions she would need to make. The day had barely begun when Livia woke up with her delicate cry. Isabella Rossi, still getting used to the idea of caring for a child, went to the makeshift cradle and picked the girl up in her arms, trying to soothe her with a soft voice. "It's okay, Piccola. Mama is here," she said in a tone that surprised even herself. Isabella Rossi had never called herself a mother before. The sound of that word slipped from her lips as if it had always been a part of her, and for a moment, she felt more connected to Livia than she had ever imagined. However, the reality of her situation would not take long to knock on her door. While feeding the baby with an improvised bottle, Isabella Rossi began to reflect on the difficulties she would face. Her resources were limited, and the little money she earned would barely be enough to support a child. Even so, something inside her had already decided, she would not leave Livia. With Livia in her arms, Isabella Rossi stepped out onto the street, feeling the curious and suspicious gazes of her neighbors. News spread quickly in small neighborhoods, and soon everyone knew that the elderly woman had found a baby. The whispers and judging looks followed her around every corner. "Did you hear? She has a child now. I don't know how she's going to manage," one of the neighbors whispered, pressing her lips in disapproval. "That old woman can hardly take care of herself, imagine a baby," another replied. Laughing softly. Isabella Rossi heard the comments but stood firm. She knew that people didn't understand her decision, but they also couldn't comprehend the emptiness she had carried for so many years. Livia was now her light, and for the first time in a long time, Isabella Rossi had something to fight for. As she collected bottles and recyclable cans in front of a store, one of the merchants, Giovanni, called her over to talk. "Isabella Rossi, I heard you have a baby. Is that true?" he asked, his face creased with concern. She took a deep breath before responding. "Yes, Giovanni. I found the little girl abandoned, and I couldn't leave her there. She is my responsibility now." Giovanni looked at her with a mix of admiration and surprise. "But how will you take care of her? You know how things are around here." "It won't be easy," he scratched his head, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Isabella Rossi nodded, aware of the difficulties. "I know it won't be easy, but I can't abandon her. I am all she has." Her voice was firm, but her eyes revealed the uncertainty she felt inside. Giovanni fell silent for a moment, but then reached out, lightly touching the elderly woman's arm. "Well, if you need anything, you know where to find me, Isabella Rossi." She thanked him with a small smile and continued on her way, realizing that the weight of the decisions she had made wouldn't become light anytime soon. The town was small, and everyone knew of her situation. Gossip was inevitable, but she couldn't let it get her down. On her way home, tired and with Livia asleep in her arms, Isabella Rossi looked at the little girl and saw in her more than just an abandoned baby. She saw an opportunity to rewrite her own story, to heal the wounds she had carried from the past, and above all, to give Livia what she had never been able to provide for the child she lost. "We're going to make it, Livia," she murmured, placing a gentle kiss on the baby's forehead. As she prepared for the night, Isabella Rossi mentally organized what she needed to do. She knew she would have to keep working hard to support both of them, but she also understood that now she had a greater responsibility. She needed to ensure that Livia was always safe, fed, and loved. Deep down, she felt fear of failing, fear of not being strong enough. But every time Livia smiled at her, even in her fragile and vulnerable state, Isabella Rossi felt her determination grow. No matter what others said, she had decided Livia would be her daughter. The heartfelt decision was made, and there was no turning back. The sun had barely risen when Isabella Rossi left home as usual, with Livia nestled in an improvised basket. The little girl had already grown accustomed to the simple and modest routine of Isabella Rossi, who took her with her wherever she went. As the elderly woman worked, collecting recyclable materials and selling her crafts, Livia watched the world with curious eyes, absorbing every detail around her. However, that day, something different was about to happen. At the end of one of the neighborhood streets, a heavy-set man watched from a distance. Marco, the name that Isabella Rossi had been trying to forget for so long, was back in town, and his presence, though silent and distant, brought with it memories that Isabella Rossi preferred to keep buried. Marco had aged poorly, his once vibrant face was marked by deep wrinkles and a tired gaze. Life had not been kind to him since he abandoned Isabella Rossi. After leaving her life, he had become involved in several relationships and eventually fell into addictions that corroded everything he had achieved. Now back in town, he was not the same man Isabella Rossi had known all those years ago. Marco watched her from afar as she pushed her wheelbarrow with Livia shielded from the wind. He had heard from some neighbors about the girl that Isabella Rossi had found, and this intrigued him. He didn't quite know what he was feeling, a mix of regret and curiosity consumed him. Isabella Rossi, however, had not noticed his presence, she was focused on her work as always. When she stopped in front of a store to collect some bottles, Giovanni, the merchant, appeared again. "Isabella Rossi, have you heard the latest news?" he asked with a tense expression. She looked at him, not understanding. "No, what happened?" "Marco is back," the words came out cautiously, aware of the weight they carried. The name echoed in Isabella Rossi's mind like a knife slowly turning. For a moment, she felt her legs weaken, but she quickly regained control, masking her shock. "Marco?" She could barely pronounce the name as if it were a strange word in her mouth. Giovanni nodded. "Yes, it seems he came back a few days ago. No one knows for sure why, but he's around." Isabella Rossi fell silent, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Marco, the man who had abandoned her during one of the toughest moments of her life, was back. She didn't know how to react, part of her wanted to hide, to avoid any contact, but another part, the most hurt and resentful, felt urged to confront him, to demand explanations for the wounds he had caused. "Thank you for letting me know, Giovanni," she said finally, with a firm but cold voice. He nodded and stepped away, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Isabella Rossi looked at Livia, who was asleep in the basket, oblivious to the whirlwind of emotions around her. How could Marco show up now, just when she had found a new purpose in her life? The following days were marked by an invisible tension. Although she hadn't seen him in person, Isabella Rossi knew Marco was nearby. Each step she took through the neighborhood felt accompanied by a shadow. Her heart raced at every corner, expecting him to appear before her at any moment. And then one afternoon, while she was collecting recyclable materials on one of the more secluded streets, he appeared. "Isabella Rossi," his voice echoed behind her, laden with a mix of regret and hesitation. She rose, time seemed to stop at that moment. Slowly, she turned to face him. Marco stood just a few meters away, with the same weary expression she had expected, but with something more in his eyes, remorse. "What do you want?" Isabella Rossi asked, her voice harsher than she intended. Marco hesitated, shoving his hands into his pockets and lowering his head. I heard about the girl, about Livia," he said awkwardly. Isabella Rossi felt a wave of anger rise within her. How dare he speak about Livia? He, who had abandoned her when she needed him most, was now interested in the child she had taken in. "That's none of your business, Marco," she replied firmly. "You have no right to interfere in my life, not anymore." Marco looked up, hurt by her response. I know I was wrong, Isabella Rossi," he took a step forward, "but I wanted to know if you're okay, if you need help." She let out a bitter laugh. "Now you want to know if I'm okay after all these years?" The pain she had buried for so long began to resurface. I don't need you. I never did. I'm raising Livia on my own, and I'm doing just fine. Marco fell silent, at a loss for words. What could he say? The wounds he had caused wouldn't heal so easily, and he knew that. I just wanted, he hesitated, trying to find the right words, I just wanted to know if there was anything I could do to help. Isabella Rossi looked at him, her anger easing a bit, but not completely fading away. The only thing you can do is leave me alone, Marco, she said, her voice firm but controlled. He nodded, accepting his sentence without another word. Marco turned and began to walk away, his figure slowly disappearing down the deserted street. The days passed slowly after the brief and painful reunion with Marco. Isabella Rossi felt the weight of the past becoming lighter, but she knew that what mattered most now was Livia's future. One morning, while Isabella Rossi was finishing up a simple breakfast for herself and Livia, a firm knock sounded at the door. Her heart raced immediately, a feeling that something was wrong. When she opened the door, she found a middle-aged woman in a formal suit, accompanied by a younger man holding a clipboard. "Good morning, ma'am," the woman said with a polite but formal smile. "I'm Elena, a social worker from the Child Welfare Department. This is my colleague, Luca. We've received a report and would like to speak with you if possible." Isabella Rossi felt the ground shake beneath her feet. She looked at Livia, who was innocently playing with an improvised toy, and then back at Elena. "A report?" Isabella Rossi asked, trying to remain calm but feeling anxiety rising. "About what?" Elena exchanged a quick glance with Luca before responding. "We received a report that you are caring for a child but do not have the necessary resources to ensure her well-being. We need to verify the conditions in which this child is living and better understand the situation." Isabella Rossi felt her heart tighten. The neighbors' gossip had finally reached its peak, the same people who had watched and whispered behind her back had now involved the authorities. She took a deep breath, trying to stay strong. "Come in," she said, stepping aside to let Elena and Luca enter. Isabella Rossi's small house was modest but clean and organized. She took pride in keeping everything in place, even with so few resources. Elena observed the surroundings carefully, her professional eyes catching every detail. Luca took quick notes in silence as he followed the social worker. "This is Livia," Isabella Rossi said, her voice a bit shaky as she approached the girl who looked curiously at the visitors. "I found her abandoned and decided to take care of her." Elena knelt beside Livia, observing the little girl with a gentle gaze. She smiled at the child, who returned the gesture with a shy smile. "How old is she?" Elena asked, not taking her eyes off Livia. "I'm not sure," Isabella Rossi replied. "When I found her, there was a letter left by her mother, but not much information. By my calculations, she should be a little over a year old." Elena nodded as she stood up. "Understood. Have you managed to register custody of Livia at any point?" The question made Isabella Rossi feel even more vulnerable. She knew that without the proper documents, her situation was delicate, but until that moment, she hadn't considered the legal implications of caring for Livia. She had simply followed her heart. "No," she replied, her voice low. "I couldn't. I didn't know what to do." Elena looked at her with understanding, but Isabella Rossi knew that the social worker had a duty to fulfill, regardless of how she felt. "Mrs. Isabella Rossi, I understand that your intentions are good," Elena began, her tone softer, "but without the proper documentation, we're dealing with a complicated situation. Moreover, we need to ensure that Livia has access to medical care, education, and other resources that are essential for her development." "I'm taking care of her the best I can," Isabella Rossi interrupted, feeling despair take over. "She has food, she has a roof, she has love. I didn't leave her behind like her mother did. Elena took a deep breath, feeling the pain in the elderly woman's words. We're not saying that you're not doing your best, Elena tried to reassure her, but there are legal issues involved, and it's our duty to ensure that Livia is safe and has what she needs to grow up healthy. Isabella Rossi looked at Livia, who was now playing carefree. The very thought of losing the little girl made her chest ache. To her, Livia was her daughter, even if not by blood, and the idea that the authorities could take her away was unbearable. Please, don't take her away from me, Isabella Rossi said, her voice breaking. I am all she has. I swear I will do whatever it takes. If I need help, I'll accept it, but don't take her from me. Elena looked at Luca, who was still taking notes, and then turned her attention back to Isabella Rossi. Here's what we'll do, Mrs. Isabella Rossi, Elena began in a more conciliatory tone. We will recommend support to ensure that Livia has everything she needs. We won't make any decisions right now. We will work together to resolve this situation. I will need you to seek legal help to formalize the custody, and I will do what I can to assist with that process. Isabella Rossi nodded, relieved to know that at least for now, she wouldn't lose Livia. Elena and Luca prepared to leave, but before departing, Elena turned and said, Remember, we're here to ensure the best for Livia. If you need anything, I'll be nearby. As soon as the door closed, Isabella Rossi collapsed into a chair, tears streaming silently down her face. The weeks following Elena's visit brought a whirlwind of emotions for Isabella Rossi. The threat of losing Livia loomed like a shadow over her life. Although the social worker had assured her that no immediate action would be taken, the fear of something happening continued to gnaw at Isabella Rossi from within. She knew she needed to regularize the custody of the girl, but the process was confusing and complicated for someone like her who had never dealt with such legal matters. One afternoon, while caring for Livia, who was now taking her first steps in the small yard, Isabella Rossi heard the phone ring. The old device, which she hardly ever used, was covered in dust, but the call felt urgent. She quickly picked it up, her heart racing. Mrs. Isabella Rossi, it's Elena on the other end of the line. I have news about the custody process for Livia. I managed to schedule a meeting with a lawyer who can help you formalize the situation, but we need to act quickly. The authorities are starting to apply pressure. Panic surged up her spine. Pressure? What does that mean? Are they going to take Livia away from me? Isabella Rossi felt her throat tighten as if the words could barely escape. Elena hesitated for a moment before responding gently. We haven't reached that point yet, but we need to show that we are taking action. The lawyer I mentioned is experienced in cases like yours and can guide you. I'll send you the address so you can meet with him. Isabella Rossi felt a momentary relief, but the fear still lingered. She hung up the phone and looked at Livia, who was innocently playing with an improvised toy, unaware of the storm approaching. The little girl, with her bright eyes and easy smile, was now the center of Isabella Rossi's world. The very thought of losing her made her heart ache in a way she hadn't thought possible. Days later, Isabella Rossi met with the lawyer. The office was small but cozy, and the man who welcomed her, Antonio, seemed understanding and experienced. He listened attentively as she explained how she had found Livia, how she was taking care of the little girl, and how much it meant to her. Mrs. Isabella Rossi, I understand that you are in a difficult situation, Antonio said, flipping through some papers she had brought. The absence of formal custody documents is a serious issue, but not insurmountable. We need to regularize the situation as soon as possible to prevent the authorities from intervening negatively. Isabella Rossi nodded, feeling the anguish tighten her chest again. But what if I can't? What if they take her away? The question came out laden with despair, and her eyes filled with tears. Antonio paused for a moment and looked her in the eyes. I'll be honest with you. Isabella Rossi. If we don't do anything, the chances of Livia being taken are real. However, if we act now and show that you are committed to following the legal procedures, we will have a strong argument to keep Livia in your care. And of course, if there is any risk, we will fight with all our strength. Isabella Rossi held back her tears, clinging to the only hope she had left. Antonio began to guide her on the steps that needed to be taken: regular medical visits for Livia, proof of income, testimonials from neighbors who could attest to her character and her ability to care for the girl. The following days were a whirlwind of appointments, all aimed at showing that Isabella Rossi had the minimum conditions to ensure Livia's well-being, even with her limited resources. She worked hard to meet all the requirements, took Livia to the doctor, bought new clothes with her small savings, and even started talking to some neighbors to ensure they would speak in her favor, although most of them still looked at her with suspicion. Amidst all the chaos, Marco reappeared. He had tried to keep his distance after their last conversation, but upon learning that the authorities were involved, he decided to approach again. He came to Isabella Rossi's house one afternoon when Livia was napping. "Isabella Rossi, can I talk to you?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. She looked at him for a moment, feeling discomfort grow. She didn't want his presence, but she knew he wouldn't leave her in peace so easily. "What do you want, Marco?" "I've already told you I don't need you," Isabella Rossi said, her voice firm but her patience limited. I heard about the situation with the authorities. I want to help." Marco looked at the ground as if carefully choosing his words. "I know I wasn't the best husband, and that I left you at the worst time, but this is different. I don't want to see you lose Livia." Isabella Rossi crossed her arms, suspicious. "And what do you think you can do for us?" she asked coldly. Marco took a step forward, trying to appear sincere. "I have contacts, Isabella Rossi. I know people who can help us, who can speak on your behalf and speed up the custody process. I want to make things right." The idea of accepting Marco's help repulsed Isabella Rossi. He had abandoned her when she needed him most, and now suddenly, he wanted to be the hero of the story. But the desperation in her heart, the fear of losing Livia, made her hesitate. "I'll think about it," she said, not wanting to give more space to the conversation. Marco nodded and stepped back but made it clear he was available if she needed him. Isabella Rossi watched him walk away, feeling an internal conflict between her disgust for Marco and the desire to ensure Livia stayed with her. Days later, the first hearing was scheduled. Elena would be present as a witness, and Livia's future would be discussed. Isabella Rossi knew this would be the most important moment of her life. The courtroom was filled with silence, the air felt dense as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the events to unfold. Isabella Rossi sat next to Antonio, the lawyer, with trembling hands in her lap. Across the room, Elena and a representative from the Child Welfare Department observed attentively. Livia's future was about to be decided, and the weight of this reality was almost unbearable for Isabella Rossi. The judge entered, and the session began. The first part of the hearing consisted of formal introductions, with Elena explaining Livia's situation and the effort Isabella Rossi had made to care for the little girl. Elena, to Isabella Rossi's surprise, spoke favorably, highlighting the dedication the elderly woman had shown and her deep love for Livia. "I have no doubt that Isabella Rossi provides Livia with a loving home," Elena said, looking directly at the judge. "However, we also know there are financial challenges and the absence of legal custody documentation, which brings us to this process." Antonio then stood up, ready to defend his client. "Your Honor, we are working to regularize the situation. My client, Isabella Rossi, may not have all the financial resources she needs, but she has something that no institution can offer: the commitment to raise Livia as if she were her daughter. There is no doubt that she loves this child and is willing to do whatever it takes to ensure her well-being. As Antonio spoke, Isabella Rossi looked at the door of the room as if waiting for something bad to happen, and then it happened. The door slowly opened, and a man walked in. He was impeccably dressed, wearing a dark suit and exuding confidence. His footsteps echoed on the marble floor as he approached Elena's table and whispered something in her ear. Elena immediately looked up and whispered back, her face filled with surprise. "Your Honor," Elena said, interrupting Antonio, "it seems we have new information that needs to be considered. This is Luciano Bianchi, and he claims to be Livia's biological grandfather." Isabella Rossi felt the blood drain from her face. "Grandfather? How is that possible?" She looked at Antonio, who also seemed surprised but tried to maintain his composure. "What kind of new information is this?" the judge asked, adjusting his glasses as he flipped through the papers in front of him. Luciano, the man who had just entered, took the floor. "Your Honor, I am Luciano Bianchi, the father of Chiara, Livia's biological mother." He looked directly at Isabella Rossi, who was stunned. "I recently discovered about my granddaughter's existence, and I have come to claim her custody." The silence in the room was overwhelming. Isabella Rossi felt her body tremble. How could there be a grandfather, a biological family, when Livia had been abandoned? Livia's mother never mentioned a father or any close relatives. Livia's mother never spoke of me because we had been estranged for years. When I found out about her illness, it was too late. She passed away before I could do anything. But now that I know about Livia, I can't just stand by. She is my granddaughter, and I want to be part of her life, Luciano responded, his voice sincere. The judge looked at Elena, seeking confirmation. "Mr. Luciano came to our department recently after hiring a private detective to locate Livia. We have evidence that he is indeed Chiara's father, but we still need to verify all the information." Isabella Rossi looked at Livia, who was playing carefree in a corner of the room, unaware of the chaos surrounding her. Her heart ached. She knew that Luciano, with his resources and confident demeanor, could pose a real threat to her relationship with Livia. I didn't know any of this," Isabella Rossi stammered, her voice low. "But Livia is my daughter by heart. I've cared for her since I found her. It doesn't matter what biology says, she is mine." Luciano watched her for a moment, then turned to the judge. "I'm not here to take Livia from Isabella Rossi," he said calmly. "I want to be part of her life, yes, but I don't want to take her away from those who love her. I have resources and I can ensure a safe future for my granddaughter. All I ask is to be present as a grandfather and help ensure that Livia has what she needs." Those words, although reassuring, left Isabella Rossi even more conflicted. On one hand, it was a relief to know that Luciano wasn't there to rip Livia from her arms, but on the other hand, the idea of sharing custody of the little girl with a complete stranger terrified her. The judge paused, considering all the information. "Mr. Bianchi, your entrance into this process is unexpected. We will need more time to analyze the evidence and determine what is best for Livia. However, for now, we will not make any final decisions. Isabella Rossi, the temporary custody of Livia will remain with you while we continue the investigation," he said, looking directly at her. After the hearing, Isabella Rossi left the courthouse with heavy steps, feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders. Livia, unaware of the turmoil, was in her arms, playing with a simple keychain. Luciano's presence had been an unexpected blow, and although he had not shown hostility, Isabella Rossi could not fully trust his intentions. How could she? This man had appeared out of nowhere, claiming a connection to the girl who was now her daughter in every sense but blood. On the way home, Isabella Rossi walked in silence, reflecting on everything that had happened. Her thoughts were in disarray, and the fear of losing Livia consumed her. She didn't know if she had the strength to face a new challenge, especially with someone as powerful and influential as Luciano. Upon arriving home, she found an envelope under the door. It was a letter from Luciano, asking to meet her the next day at a local cafe. He wanted to talk without lawyers or courts, just the two of them. The next day, Isabella Rossi accepted the invitation. She needed to understand what Luciano really wanted. Livia stayed with Elena, who had become an important ally in the fight for custody, while Isabella Rossi went to the meeting. The cafe was small and discreet, away from the city center. When she arrived, Luciano was already sitting, dressed casually, a stark contrast to the rigid demeanor he had shown in court. He stood up when he saw her enter and greeted her with a nod. "Thank you for coming, Isabella Rossi," he said, gesturing for her to take a seat. She sat down, keeping a cautious gaze. "I'm here because I want to understand what you really want, Luciano. You appeared out of nowhere, claiming to be Livia's grandfather, and now you want to be part of her life. But what does that really mean?" Luciano took a deep breath, seeming thoughtful for a moment before responding. "I understand your suspicion. I would be suspicious too in your place. The truth is, until recently, I didn't know about Livia's existence. My daughter Chiara and I had been estranged, and I only learned about her illness and my granddaughter when it was too late." Isabella Rossi kept her gaze fixed, trying to read the intentions behind his words. "But why now? Why show up when Livia is already in my care? She is happy with me, and I'm taking care of her with all the love I can offer." Luciano nodded as if he were weighing each word before responding. "I don't want to take Livia away from you, Isabella Rossi," he said sincerely. "In fact, I admire what you've done. Adopting a child, especially under your circumstances, is an act of love and courage. But I am her grandfather, and I also have responsibilities. I have resources, connections, and I can ensure that Livia has a safe future. I don't want to replace you, I just want to be present as a grandfather." Isabella Rossi fell silent, her hands gripping the fabric of her skirt as she tried to absorb what he was saying. "And what exactly do you propose?" she asked, her voice softer but still filled with uncertainty. Luciano leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I propose a partnership, Isabella Rossi," he said with a sincere tone. "You continue taking care of Livia, being her mother as you've always done. I won't interfere with that, but at the same time, I would like to be part of her life. I want her to know that she has a larger family, that she has a grandfather who can support her when needed. Moreover, I can help you. I know the financial situation isn't easy, and I want Livia to have what she deserves." Isabella Rossi looked at him, bewildered. It was a generous offer, but she knew that accepting meant allowing Luciano to enter their lives, and that made her uncomfortable. "I don't need charity," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Livia is happy with the little we have. I don't want her to feel torn between two worlds." Luciano shook his head. "It's not charity, Isabella Rossi," he corrected gently. "It's a way to ensure that Livia has the best of both worlds. You're already doing an amazing job caring for her, but I can help make things easier. I want her to have opportunities that you might not be able to provide on your own, and I want to do this without taking away what you've already built with her." Isabella Rossi felt the weight of the offer. On one hand, accepting Luciano's help meant securing a more stable future for Livia. On the other hand, she feared it would create an emotional distance between her and the little girl. "And what if she becomes closer to you than to me?" Isabella Rossi asked, her voice finally revealing the vulnerability she felt. "What if she forgets me?" Luciano sighed, looking directly at her. "That will never happen," he said firmly. "The bond you have built with Livia is unbreakable. I'm not here to replace you, I'm here to add something to her life, not to take your place. Isabella Rossi remained silent for a long time, thinking about Livia, the smiling girl she had taken in without hesitation, and the uncertain future that now awaited them. Luciano seemed sincere, and his offer was tempting, but Isabella Rossi knew that the decision needed to be made carefully. Finally, she lifted her eyes and replied, "I accept your help, Luciano," she said, her voice firm but full of emotion. "But with one condition, you will not interfere with how I take care of Livia. She is my daughter in heart, and nothing will change that." Luciano smiled, relieved. "I agree, Isabella Rossi," he said with a respectful tone. "Let's work together to ensure that Livia has everything she needs. I won't interfere, I'll be here as support, not as a threat." The days following the agreement between Isabella Rossi and Luciano brought a mix of relief and apprehension. Their interactions were initially cautious. Luciano visited Isabella Rossi's home regularly, always bringing something for Livia, children's books, simple toys, or sometimes even a treat. The little girl, curious by nature, gradually began to warm up to him, with that innocent trust that only children possess. For Isabella Rossi, each interaction between them was proof that her fear of losing the bond between them was strong, unshakable, and Livia made that clear every time she ran into Isabella Rossi's arms at the end of each visit from Luciano. "She likes you, Isabella Rossi," Luciano commented one afternoon while watching Livia play in the yard. "You are her mother, that's clear, and I respect that." Isabella Rossi looked at him, relieved but still cautious. "That's all I want, Luciano, for her to know that no matter what happens, I will always be here for her," she replied, her voice soft but firm. Luciano nodded, showing that he understood the depth of the connection between Isabella Rossi and Livia. It was clear to him that there was no replacing the place Isabella Rossi occupied in the girl's heart. He wanted to be a present grandfather but never a competitor. As time went on, Livia began to refer to Luciano as "Nano," grandfather. The word rolled off her tongue naturally, and when he heard it for the first time, Luciano was almost moved to tears. For him, that word meant that in some way, he had found a place in the girl's life. Isabella Rossi, on the other hand, watched the moment with mixed feelings but allowed herself to relax, understanding that Livia still ran to her arms for comfort and affection. "She's happy," Luciano said, smiling as he watched Livia flip through one of the books he had brought. "And that's all that matters." Life continued with this new dynamic. Luciano helped financially, ensuring that Livia had access to doctors, clothes, and a proper education. Despite her initial distrust, Isabella Rossi began to realize that Luciano was genuinely committed to being part of his granddaughter's life without interfering in her upbringing. He respected the boundaries that Isabella Rossi had set, and gradually, the two began to understand each other. However, not everything was as peaceful as it seemed. Marco, Isabella Rossi's ex-husband, learned about Luciano's presence and the changes in the life of the woman he had abandoned. Driven by a mix of curiosity and resentment, Marco began to lurk around Isabella Rossi's house more frequently. Although he didn't approach directly, his presence was felt like a shadow from the past that Isabella Rossi preferred to forget. One night, while Livia slept peacefully, Isabella Rossi went out to the porch to breathe in the fresh night air. To her surprise, she found Marco standing on the corner, watching the house from afar. "What are you doing here, Marco?" she asked, her voice firm and filled with disdain. He hesitated before answering, as if struggling to find the right words. I heard about what's happening, about Luciano, about Livia, and I wanted to know how you are." Isabella Rossi let out a bitter laugh. "You want to know how I am after all these years, after everything you did?" She shook her head, incredulous. "I don't need you, Marco. Livia is my daughter now, and we're fine without you. Marco took a step forward, trying to get closer. I know I was wrong, Isabella Rossi, he said, his voice heavy with regret. But I don't want to lose the little I have left. Maybe I can help. Isabella Rossi crossed her arms, feeling a growing anger. Help, she repeated incredulously. You had your chance, Marco, and you threw it away. I don't need you, and Livia certainly doesn't. Marco lowered his head, defeated. I just wanted to make things right, he said, his voice almost a whisper. Isabella Rossi watched him for a moment, her anger still present but mixed with a sense of pity. You made your choices, Marco, and I made mine. Now go away, there's nothing left for you here. He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the regret of years of mistakes and poor decisions. Without another word, Marco turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the night. Isabella Rossi stood there, feeling the weight of that encounter but also a sense of relief. The past was finally being left behind. The next day, Isabella Rossi and Livia joined Luciano for a walk in the park. The sun was shining brightly, and Livia was joyfully running between the trees, laughing with the innocence of a child who has no worries in the world. She is a special girl, Luciano said, watching the scene with a smile. Isabella Rossi agreed, yes, she is, she said, looking at Livia with tenderness. And no matter what the future brings, we will make sure she stays this way, happy and loved. As she watched Livia play, Isabella Rossi felt a peace she hadn't experienced in years. Despite all the challenges, she had found a new family. Livia had a home, a loving grandfather, and Isabella Rossi finally allowed herself to believe that the future would be kinder than the past. As the months went by, the lives of Isabella Rossi, Livia, and Luciano found a new normal. The bond between them grew stronger, and the little girl was surrounded by love and security. Isabella Rossi, though always cautious, began to realize that with Luciano's help, Livia would have opportunities that she could never provide on her own, but that didn't mean she would stop being the mother the girl needed. Her constant presence, care, and dedication never wavered. Doctor visits became regular, Livia started attending a nearby daycare, and the resources Luciano provided allowed the girl to have everything a child her age needed to grow happy and healthy. Isabella Rossi continued her work in recycling and crafts, always finding time to be with Livia, whether helping with schoolwork or simply telling stories before bed. One day, while they were walking through the town square, Livia asked Isabella Rossi an unexpected question. Mommy, do you think I can be anything when I grow up? Isabella Rossi looked at the girl, surprised by the depth of the question, especially for someone so young. She smiled, her eyes misting with emotion. Yes, Livia, she replied, her voice soft but firm. You can be anything you want, and I will always be here to support you. Livia smiled back, pleased with the answer, and went back to running around the park, exploring every corner as if it were a new world. Luciano, who was sitting next to Isabella Rossi, also smiled, watching the girl with tenderness. She's lucky to have you, he commented, looking at Isabella Rossi with admiration. We're lucky to have her, Isabella Rossi replied, her tone filled with gratitude. She changed my life, Luciano. At first, I was lost, but now I feel like I found a purpose. Luciano nodded, fully understanding what Isabella Rossi meant. For him, Livia had also been an unexpected blessing, a second chance to build something he never had with his daughter, Chiara. However, as life stabilized, there was still one last pending issue, the final hearing regarding Livia's custody. Although Isabella Rossi had temporary custody, the judge still needed to make a definitive decision. The support from Luciano, the financial help, and the good relationship between the two counted in her favor, but Isabella Rossi knew that the system was unpredictable, and the ghost of Marco, still occasionally lurking, added another layer of uncertainty to the situation. When the day of the final hearing arrived, Isabella Rossi was more nervous than she had ever been. She and Luciano sat side by side in the courtroom, waiting for the judge's decision. Antonio, the lawyer, had presented a strong case, arguing that Livia was being cared for with love and dedication, that she had a safe home, and that her education and health were assured. To Isabella Rossi's relief, Marco did not show up. It seemed he had finally understood that his place in their lives had disappeared. The judge flipped through the papers in front of him, carefully analyzing every detail. After a few moments of silence that felt like an eternity, he finally looked up. After reviewing all the documents and considering the involved witnesses, I have reached a decision, the judge announced in a serious yet calm tone. The legal custody of Livia will remain with Isabella Rossi, who has proven to be the best caregiver for the girl. However, we recognize Mr. Luciano Bianchi's role as a grandfather and financial supporter, and his presence will be encouraged in the upbringing of Livia. Isabella Rossi felt a wave of relief wash over her. Tears began to stream down her face as she looked at Luciano, who was also smiling, clearly relieved by the decision. "Thank you very much, Your Honor," Isabella Rossi said, her voice choked with emotion. The judge nodded. "I certify that this child will be well cared for," he said with a slight smile. "And that above all, she will be surrounded by love." As they left the courtroom, Isabella Rossi hugged Livia tightly, feeling as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The future, which had once seemed uncertain and full of obstacles, now appeared clearer. Livia was her daughter in heart and soul, and nothing could change that. "Let's go home, Piccola," she whispered in Livia's ear, who smiled and nodded. The following months were peaceful. Livia continued to grow, becoming more curious and full of energy each day. Isabella Rossi and Luciano, now with a relationship built on respect and cooperation, worked together to ensure that the little girl had everything she needed. Luciano's support was essential, but Isabella Rossi's love was what truly guided Livia on her path. One day, at the end of a summer afternoon, as the sun set on the horizon, Isabella Rossi watched Livia play in the yard. Luciano was beside her, and they both contemplated the simple joy of the little girl. "I think everything turned out well in the end," Luciano said with a light smile. Isabella Rossi nodded, her eyes filled with tenderness. "Yes," she replied, her heart at peace. "Everything turned out well. Livia found her family, and so did I." And under a sky painted orange and pink, Livia ran freely, surrounded by a love that protected and guided her, ready to face the world knowing she would never be alone. Note: this script has been adapted to avoid direct copyright issues by changing names and specific details while maintaining the essence of the story. It is designed to fall under YouTube's fair use doctrine, focusing on transformative use for inspiration, education, and commentary. Remember to engage with your audience directly, encourage comments for emotional feedback, and ensure the narrative aligns with your channel's content strategy to keep viewers engaged until the end.